Hey, this is Cap, and you're watching Thorin, the only man besides Richard Lewis who somehow found a way to get both League of Legends and Dota Redditors to hate him.
Esportspools doesn't care who you are. They only care if you're interested in fantasy esports and betting, and/or betting. If so, well, for a start off, they have free competitions sometimes, such as the exclusive pools they set up with my name on for certain big events, which are free to enter, but you can win skins as prizes. If you've got some skrill to bet, they have live in-play betting, which is an interesting feature. When you play the game, when you're watching a stream, they'll generate bets on the side for things like, will so-and-so get an AK kill in the next round? They'll generate them based on what's happening in the game, and you pick whether you bet on these things live as you're watching the game. So you can be watching the game and making these little bets on the side if they find that entertaining. Now, computers don't care who you are. It's a fact. You can look at all the possible significant aspects that can affect a computer, and specifically a computer game, and who you are as a person will not actually impact or affect that unless for some bizarre reason it's been programmed that way specifically. And I can't think of any instance in a video game where that would be the case. But you have to set up the context all the same of why that's important. Why would I think that's fantastic? Why would I appreciate that? Because consider other contexts in life. Like, we are trained by consuming so much media, so many stories, movies, songs, to follow certain tropes, certain themes, to expect, to anticipate storylines to play out in a movie or in a novel or in a song, obeying certain principles that actually go back to myth, which themselves are built upon or drawn from archetypes within how humans think of certain things, how we model certain things. And you know what? We don't get these things in esports. Like, we don't get happy endings that we want simply because we want them and because they fit a storyline, which in a movie or a comic or a book or a song is how it would end to be satisfying and to feel like you learned something and the message was completed and the parable meant something. Life doesn't play out that way because life isn't a parable. Life isn't a story. It isn't a myth. And so, for example, in League of Legends, it was a great story. There was one of the best European support players back in Season 2 was a German player called N-Rated. And he played for Fnatic after playing against All Authority. And in Fnatic, they went from strength to strength. And eventually, by the time LCS began in the early Season 3, Fnatic actually had become the best team. And they would go on to win the split. But what happened was, N-Rated ended up getting kicked from Fnatic. And he was replaced. What they did was they slid Yellowstar, who's the AD carry, over, made him the support, and when they could later on bring in Reckless, they planned to bring in Reckless as AD carry, but before that, they brought in a player called Pushu to be the AD carry, who you might remember they took to Season 3 Worlds. Now, when N-Rated was kicked, they never fully explained why. I've heard some of the things behind the scenes. Essentially, you can just put it down very simply to personal conflicts. When he was kicked from this team and replaced, Fnatic was the number one team. They're the best team in LCS. But he went away, and he ended up, at the end of the year, after coaching Evil Geniuses and Lemon Dogs at Worlds, he went away and he joined SK Gaming, who just gotten back into LCS. They'd been in relegation. Nif had hard carried them, their support player, who's thought of as one of the best European support players. He'd hard carried them through the relegations versus Super Hot Crew, but then he'd left and gone and joined Alliance. And in comes N-Rated. And when he joins this team, this is a team which was expected, anticipated to be one of the worst in the EU LCS. They had Freddy122 as their top laner, not a particularly highly touted top laner. He'd been all right on against All Authority in the previous season, but not one of the best top laners at the time. They had Svenskeren, who was just making a comeback. He'd obviously gone when Copenhagen Wolves had changed to NIP, and then he'd left when they'd kicked out the AD carry and the, I think it was the AD carry and the top laner from what I remember. I think it was like Godbro and what was the name of the AD carry? I forget right now, actually. It's not that relevant, obviously. And they had brought in Jezis to be the mid laner. Obviously now, actually, the support player of Fnatic, funnily enough, to almost complete the circle there. But at the time, a rookie mid laner in terms of LCS, definitely not highly touted, didn't go on to be fantastic. He was just all right. They had N-Rated at support, obviously, but himself thought to have been weakened because he'd been kicked and hadn't been picked up by teams like Alliance, etc. And then at AD carry, they had Candy Panda, who was traditionally one of the top half type AD carries in Europe. But he'd also played a long time in his career with Nif as a bot lane. He was losing Nif now. Nif suited him very well. No one knew how Enrated would work with him. A lot of people thought maybe it's time for Candy Panda to take a step back. And so most people looked at this team and they were like, this team's not going in there. Where's the star players? Where's the good players even? None of these players in theory are top players at their positions. But Enrated started out, and he'd always been known for his very good strategical understanding and some of his shot calling he'd done in Fnatic, and he began to apply this to SK Gaming. And they went from strength to strength, and they became a very good macro team, and they made really good decisions, and each player in the team found a way to function and either be good or above average within the context of the team, and they would win all these games, despite the fact at the time you still looked at them and said, where's the best player in this team? Like, who is the player who would be an all-star? Like, perhaps towards the end, you could say Freddy122 looked very good. Beyond that, okay, Svenskeren had times he looked pretty good. He wasn't quite as good as the next year, I wouldn't say, when he was with Forgiven, but he was pretty good, okay, but still, no player was the best at their role. But at the end of the regular split, they were number one in the regular split. They actually won the regular split of spring of Season 4. And they went into the playoffs. And luckily for them, Gambit, who was still a very dangerous team, got beaten by Roccat and played against SK in the semi-finals. SK beat Roccat. This was the original Roccat with Overpower, etc. And Zaxxas and Celiva. And SK Gaming managed to beat Roccat. And in the final of LCS, who did they play? Well, they played the team that had been in every LCS final at that point in time. Going into their third LCS final was Fnatic, the very team that Enrated had been kicked from, that he'd rebuilt his squad and beaten out for the ranking in the regular season, and now he's playing them in the final after overcoming so much, making a team that has great macro, etc. Now, if this was a movie or a story or a poem or just a tale of old that a bard was telling you, to make the story satisfying, you'd imagine, right? Admittedly, maybe not in like some of the Viking myths, but in a story in the modern day, obviously Enrated would somehow win and he'd be integral to how they'd win the final. And in doing so, you'd be able to have like the satisfaction of like he got revenge and he completed his story arc and he showed he was a valuable player. Now, you know what? It didn't happen. He just lost, and he lost fairly convincingly to the opponent. Like, I guess you should say unconvincingly there. And it just ended up looking like, the big closure never happened. Now, listen, it did in a sense. He accomplished great things, and he went on and did some good things beyond that. Qualified for Worlds, was again in one of the best teams in Europe when he had Forgiven, etc. But the storyline didn't complete, right? Likewise, whenever I've watched the fantastic Zerg player Sue in StarCraft 2 play, every single final, and he's been in something ridiculous, like 7 or 8 finals now, and won none of them, except I guess technically he won one when he won that like Kesper Cup thing, but that wasn't considered like a big final. He'd been in like 6 or 7 big finals. I think it's like 6 GSL Code S finals, and then he's also obviously been in, although I think technically one was called WCS, no, it would have been GSL still, and then also he was obviously in BlizzCon final now, right? Each time, if he'd have won any of these, but especially each of the last ones, that would have provided a sense of closure. People would say, right, he didn't win the rest, but he did finally win. We always knew he was one of the great players. This would have made up for him losing some of those ones. It wouldn't, but again, this is the way that fairy tale logic, movie logic works. Guess what? He didn't. He lost every one of them. And by the way, he never got blown out in any of them, so it was never like you could be like, oh, it's okay. Maybe he's just not that good at that stage. He would always win the couple of games, so you'd always be like, oh, maybe, and then he'd always still lose. It was unsatisfying, right? But here's what I love about video games. Here's what I love about computer games that you play, they don't know who you are, and therefore, it's just what you do to the game. That's all that matters. So computers don't care what your personality's like. They don't care what your motivations are or your political aptitude. They don't care what your gender is or what you think your gender is. They don't care what your ethnicity is. They don't care how ugly or how beautiful you might appear. They don't care whether you're religious or not, or what specific creed you follow your life by, or philosophy. They don't care, as I said, your political allegiances or philosophy. All computer games, all video games care about is which player, in the context of the game, inputs what ends up being the correct sequence to achieve victory within the defined limits and scoring format of the game. Hence, bad guys win in video games. And good guys win in video games. And entertaining people win in video games. And people who are completely bland and devoid of personality win in video games. Likewise, bad guys lose in video games. Good guys lose in video games. Entertaining people lose in video games. People who are completely bland and devoid of personality lose in video games. Did I say entertaining people win in video games? I meant lose in video games, obviously. Now, here's the thing. Life isn't like that, is it? Sure, there are some systems in areas of life that employ elements of meritocracy. I mean, in theory, if you are employing any of the tenets of free market capitalism, you should to some degree get a gain or an advantage or a benefit from being the best in some performance metric. But even so, we all know, and anyone with life experience almost certainly does, that politics, whether personal or public, play a role in your success and ability to succeed. And so you know what? Because of this, you have to factor all that in every time you consider how someone will succeed or who will win out in a certain setting. But in games, none of that matters. So it doesn't matter in games that so many people look up to and consider Reckless a better person and a nicer person and a cooler person and with a better storyline than someone like Forgiven. He doesn't get to beat Forgiven every time. He only gets to beat Forgiven if his team overall performs better and if he, perhaps in his individual performance, if that ends up being the deciding factor, can outperform someone like Forgiven. Likewise, in a 1v1 game, it's even more strict, right? It doesn't matter that people love TLO, beloved player, think he's a cool guy, model, professional, really good with the fans. Doesn't matter. If he plays against Nanawa, who's often considered antisocial or an asshole or toxic, doesn't matter. If Nanawa is better than TLO and plays better in the game, he gets to win, no matter any of those factors. In CSGO, Neo, one of the nicest guys you'll ever meet, one of the smartest guys you'll ever meet, one of the most even-keeled, great under pressure, so experienced, so decorated, one of the best players of all time in overall versions of Counter-Strike. Doesn't matter that people think Simple's toxic or detracts from the overall performance of his team. Simple can beat Neo if Simple outperforms and his team plays better. So when we're watching esports games, because of this, we get to forget about all that other stuff that impacts and impinges upon real life. We can just isolate it down to skills, smarts, ability of the players at the game and the decisions they make. And hence, esports, video games, are the ultimate equalizer because they start and they end only with what you can do inside the server. None of the other factors matter, and therefore, it doesn't matter your race, doesn't matter your background, doesn't matter who you are and what people say about you, just matters what you can do in the game, and I love them for that.